Hi guys, thank you all for tuning in and welcome back to Sewing Lara. Today we will have a look at sewing supplies for hand stitching. So especially at the beginning, when you're just starting out and you need several supplies, it can be quite expensive. So I want to give you an idea what are the must-haves and what are the nice-to-haves and what are the sewing supplies for hand stitching that I personally find you can do 100% without so that you can save yourself some money. So let's jump right into this. Here we have a group of items that I personally see as the must-haves for both hand stitching and sewing. And these are all the things that I'm using on a regular basis. Let's start over here. So I have here a box of hand stitching needles. I store here a few different types of hand stitching needles that I'm using on a regular basis, but I can already tell you for the start, all you need is a few sharps, which are universal needles. Just get them in a couple of sizes with different sizes of the ear and you'll be good to go. If you want to learn more about what hand stitching needles are out there and what to use them for, there is a video about the types of needles as a part of this course. Next, I have here a box of pins. This is how I personally like storing my pins. This jar was either a sample of a hair conditioner or a body lotion or something like that, and at some point I started storing my pins like that, and this has worked my entire life great. But of course there are also pin cushions out there, so you can either buy or make one. I honestly never bothered because this works great for me. So if you are on a budget and if you don't want to spend out a bunch of money at the beginning and you have something like that, just buy a box of pins, and they usually come in a box to begin with anyway, so you don't necessarily need anything fancy. Next, I have here these scissors. So even though these are scissors for sewing, they are not necessarily fancy, but they have always worked great for me. I bought them many years ago, and I always had them sharpened regularly. And the steel appears to be of really great quality because I've been cutting through really thick fabrics with these and through faux leather and whatnot, and they always work great. So you don't necessarily need the fanciest scissors out there. As long as you keep them sharp and as long as you use them just for sewing and not for some crazy stuff where you would damage the blades, you'll be fine. You don't need anything super expensive. Then I have here these small scissors. So before you start laughing at me, hear me out. Don't toss it till you try it. These are actually manicure scissors, which pretty much everyone has. If they are really nicely pointy and sharp, you will be able to use them also in sewing. They are not the best tool to use. However, if you already have them and you're just starting out, you don't necessarily need any other small scissors or seam rippers if you have something like that at home, at least for the beginning. Then I have here safety pins. They are great if you are creating some kind of tunnels through your fabric and you want to thread, let's say, an elastic through the tunnel or a ribbon or a cord. There is something else which you will see in the nice to have section, but as a basic equipment, safety pins are great to have. The next item that I have here is a crayon. These things are being used in order to make marks on the fabric you're working with. So the one that I have here was originally shaped like a large triangle and had rounded edges. It is nicely flat so that I can make lines with it. You can clearly see it's white, but there are also different colors if you would need one for a white fabric. I only have the one in white because I'm honestly using simply coloring pencils for white fabrics, which is not something I would necessarily recommend because you never know for sure if they're gonna wash out 100% once you made your marks, but I'm doing it anyway, and they work great for me. The difference is coloring pencils, besides the fact you are not 100% sure if you can wash them out once you made the marks, is that they're usually a little bit harder. So sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to draw on the fabric and you would need to apply more pressure than with the sewing crayon. Another option is also if you are making marks on the wrong side of the fabric and you really don't care about them staying there, to use a simple pen, which is something I'm doing all the time and it works great for me. Not something I would recommend or call professional, of course not. If you want to be professional, of course use a proper sewing crayon, but coloring pencils and pens can be also used in order to make marks. Here we have the yarn that I like working with. So it's a polyester yarn. It comes in two different sizes. So this one holds 200 meters, which is 220 yards. And the bigger spool holds 500 meters, which is 547 yards. I'm buying the bigger spools only in white and black because these are the colors that I know I will always be able to use. And for any other projects, any other different colors, I'm buying just the smaller spools. This is my favorite yarn because it has proven to be very sturdy over the years. And even though it's more expensive than some other yarns, I rather spend money on this one, and I know that once I'm done with my work, it will last. That's just my personal preference. And also you don't need to use a polyester yarn. If you prefer using cotton, you can totally work with a cotton yarn. If you want to learn more about the different types of yarn, there is a video about that as a part of this course. A quick tip when it comes to yarn. Whenever you're working with a certain color and then at the end of the project you're left with only that little yarn on the spool and you know you're probably not gonna use the color for anything else, you can still keep these spools with the yarn leftovers. You can keep them either for practicing or for any type of project where it doesn't matter what color of yarn you're using on the inside because nobody's gonna see that. So let's say if you would make a stuffed animal, once that thing is finished and the animal has been stuffed, no one's gonna know what yarn you have used on the inside. And I tell you a secret, when I made my winter coat a while ago, I used leftovers like these for the inside. So there are various colors inside, but no one knows, besides you now. So anyway, that will save you long term a little bit of money because you will use up the yarn to the very end. Oh, and I'm keeping these in an empty box from a body butter, by the way. Alright, so we covered most of the items and there are only two types of items left in my must-haves group. So I have here two guides. So this one is made of plastic, it's 40 centimeters long. And this one is made of wood and it's 50 centimeters long, so it's a little bit longer. The length can be really practical when you're making something bigger. So if you don't have a guide at home and you need to buy one, I would go with a longer one. If you already have a guide at home and it's something like this, it will do, because if you need to make a longer line, you simply make it in sections. So you don't have to go ahead and buy one that's only a couple of centimeters longer unnecessarily. And the last item in my must-haves group is a measuring tape. So this one looks like a long band. It's 60 inches long, which is 152 centimeters. There is another form of a measuring tape that looks like this. When I push this button, I can pull it out. When I let go, then it stops. It's a really practical thing, but I believe it costs a little bit more than this one, the one that looks like a band, so it's not necessary. However, I like having this one in my purse, but for sewing and stitching, I'm usually using the classical one. Admittedly, there are some projects where you would not necessarily need a measuring band and where a guide would be enough. But once you moved on to projects where you need to measure around a curve, it's definitely great to have a measuring band because it's flexible and you can measure different shapes and not just straight lines. So that has been my personal must-haves group. Now let's have a look at the group of sewing supplies that I personally see as the nice-to-haves. Of course, these can be very helpful and they can be really nice to work with, but in my personal opinion, you can still create great things without these and you can still somehow work around, and you don't necessarily have to buy these, especially not at the beginning. First, I have here these small scissors. They are called buttonhole scissors. And you guessed it, they are being used in order to cut buttonholes. So the blades are quite pointy and pretty thin, and from the side the scissors are really flat, which makes it really easy to cut a nice thin straight line. Whereas when you look at the manicure scissors, they are a little bit thicker and they are slightly curved. So I've been using these for most of my life, and whenever I would want to cut a small hole, I would have to hold them slightly at an angle. So in that case, buttonhole scissors are of course way more practical. That being said, I admit I bought them only recently, and honestly, I don't really find them that much better than my manicure scissors. It might be because I'm just used to using these and I already have my angle in the wrist and it just goes so easy because I've been using them all the time. But if I never bought the buttonhole scissors, I could have probably gone for the rest of my life without them and I could be still working with my manicure scissors. But again, there is a reason why they exist. The blades are definitely thinner and it's definitely easier to cut thin straight lines with these, so it is a nice to have item. Then we have here the seam ripper. So it looks like a little kind of a fork with one end that's longer and pointier than the other one, and there is a little blade here in the center. You can open stitches with this or cut through buttonholes. A really great tool, but if you have already, let's say, buttonhole scissors, or like some people I've heard, great manicure scissors, you can do without. But still a really nice item that will help you, because I find that cutting through stitches with this is a little bit easier than with small scissors. One thing that I really don't like about small scissors is that when I'm cutting through multiple stitches and I'm holding longer the small scissors, it gets annoying when it's wrapped around my knuckles, and you don't have the problem with a seam ripper. Then I have here these two weirdly looking needles. These are called bodkins, and they are being used in order to thread elastics or ribbons through fabric when you create some kind of a tunnel. But you can use instead of that a safety pin. I've been doing that for most of my life until I discovered that something like this actually exists, and it has worked fine. But I do find that it's nicer to work with. So long term, if you're someone who threads elastics inside of your fabric a lot, or ribbons, that would be a great investment, but you don't need these at the beginning. And of course, same goes for any other types of needles that you would use only for some special projects. They are nice to have, and you will probably buy them only when you plan a certain project, but you don't have to have them to begin with. Needle threader is something that can definitely make your life easier. If you have a really bad eyesight and you need reading glasses and you don't want to use them all the time, it can be really helpful because it's a little bit easier to find and pinch through the needle eye with this than with the thread. And also some threads like to fray at the end, and in that case it's also great to have a needle threader. But you can do without. Simply put on your reading glasses or cut the end of the needle threader and make it a little bit wet. And with a little bit of practice you can totally work without a needle threader. I usually don't use it, but there are certain projects and certain types of yarn, like for example embroidery yarn, where I find it really helpful. And last but not least, I have here this curved guide. It's great because it has the measurements on the curved sides, so when you're drawing something and you need to know the length, you can tell it very easily because it's already marked here. But at the beginning you could simply draw your curve and measure around with the measuring tape because it's flexible, so you don't necessarily need this one for the start. And I also find that this is more relevant for sewing, especially when you're altering your sewing patterns or when you're creating your own sewing patterns. Then it's really good to have something like this. And the last group are items that I do find nice, but I also find that nobody really needs these. So I have here these zigzag scissors. They are great in order to finish an edge that does not need to be hemmed. I usually use them when I cut the interfacing on a jersey piece that I'm sewing, or for some hand stitching projects. It looks nice when you have an edge that's been cut with these scissors, but it's not anything you would really need. Then I have here this really fancy sewing crayon set. So it's a set with mines. So right now I have the white mine inside, and I just realized I need to sharpen it. So there's also a sharpener, and I have here the mines in different colors for white fabrics, and then a set of white mines because that's the color you would use the most. And I paid 15 bucks for this, and honestly nobody really needs that. I just bought it because it looks pretty and it is really nice to work with this. But as I said at the beginning when we were looking at the must-haves, especially if you're making marks inside of your piece that nobody's gonna see, you can totally use just painting crayons. That being said, these mines are really nice because the crayons are relatively soft, so it's really easy to make lines also on softer fabrics or on stretchy fabrics. So I do not regret buying these, but you don't need these. It's just, that's, in my opinion, luxury. And the last two items that I personally find nobody really needs are these two bias tape forms. These are the sizes 25 and 50. You can easily make yourself your own bias tape in these two sizes without any tools. I have shown that in the tutorial how to make your own bias tape. I think that the smaller ones, which I have here, can be really helpful. These are the sizes 6, 12 and 18, but these two are really not necessary. I honestly very much regret buying the biggest size because I have used it only once when I tried it out, and then I found out that I'm actually much faster creating my own bias tape without this one. The size 25, we could argue about that, but I don't really think you need it. Of course, all my opinions are based on my personal experience. You might make a totally different experience throughout your hand stitching and sewing journey, and maybe some of the items that I don't find useful or necessary will end up being your favorite item. We all have our different preferences, so of course nothing I say is carved in stone, so please take everything with a grain of salt. And that is it for today. I still hope that this video has been helpful to you and that you enjoyed watching it. Thank you all for tuning in, and happy sewing!